right, welcome everybody. Firstly, thank you all for joining us today for this webinar with Dr. Tim Bunn. And just wanted to say, yeah, thank you. This is a great opportunity to learn, to share, and to learn about something that's really kind of important for all of us as educators and anyone working with children, and that is educational psychology. So we've asked Dr. Tim Bunn from SACUP Counseling to provide some insights for us on educational psychology and how the understanding of it can help students achieve their potential. So Dr. Tim Bunn will be able to share those insights, and he'll be able to introduce himself and his experiences shortly. He'll be sharing some slides with us as we go through the presentation, and at the end we'll do a Q&A. So if you would like to ask any questions, please put them into the chat window for everyone to see, and we will be selecting some of those questions to ask Dr. Tim at the end. This session will be recorded, and we'll put everyone on mute so there's no accidental disruptions during the presentation. But like I said, if you do have any questions, please put them into the chat window so that we can select a few at the end for Dr. Tim. All right, Dr. Tim, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Tim. That's great. Okay, so hi. It's really nice of you to invite me, everybody. Thank you. As you probably can gather from my voice, I'm British. I've actually been in Singapore for about 9.5 years. And I've done quite a variety of things in England. So I was a teacher for about 9 years and a psychologist for about 18. And I worked for the local education authority as an administrator for a while as well. And so mostly I worked for the government, but then in the last 10 years or so, I've been working more privately as well. So now I work for SACUP Counseling, which is a private counseling and psychology outfit in Singapore. And I have actually been to quite a few places in Indonesia in the last few years, also a bit the Philippines and a bit Malaysia. And we actually have quite a lot of people coming into Singapore from different other countries as well. So seeing some people from Sri Lanka and Thailand and various other places as well. So I'm a bit deprived that I can't come to Indonesia at the moment. So and I know you're having a bit of a hard time. So sorry about that. Let's hope we can, get travel bubbles and stuff going early next year. That would be nice. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of whiz through lots of things, really, covering quite a lot of ground. I guess it's mostly kind of a bit of an outline. I'm not trying to go into too much detail. I hope it's going to be possible for you to get hold of my slides at the end. So, in other words, Tim's nodding. So, in other words, don't worry too much about making notes. I think if you should also have had the example report, which I'm going to talk about at the end. So if you've got any questions and points about that, we can do that later on. Okay, so next slide, Tim. Okay, so I mean, the very broad picture is that about 15% of kids have difficulties at some time in their school career. And generally, schools and parents can see what's needed most of the time. But sometimes the teachers are a bit unsure. Sometimes parents want an outside opinion. And so that's often why a psychologist is asked to help. And the main question we're asking, or we're asked really, is, are the students achieving their potential? Are they doing as well as they could? And do they need, what kind of extra help, if any, might they need? So what we try to do is do accurate assessment and then provide constructive advice and support. We tend not to do very much of the actual direct support or therapy ourselves. We tend to be somebody who passes on to other people to do that. Okay. So in other words, we're kind of like a broker rather than a kind of online, a direct helper, I think. And hopefully we bring some kind of a background knowledge about learning difficulties, about which I'm going to talk in a minute, about alternative schools in the region or in the area, and then some knowledge of the way that the network of different helpers of different kinds, occupational therapists, speech therapists, counselors, and so on, what they can do differently to help. And not forgetting that we also very much try not just to take the adult point of view, but also to listen to the child and try and understand what's happening from the child's point of view. I think that's really important. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the kind of very broad picture I want to outline is that we talk about learning difficulties. Actually, there's slightly different jargon in different parts of the world. Learning difficulties is kind of the British way of doing it. But in other countries, they talk about learning disabilities. It varies a bit. But broadly, you can have general learning difficulties or specific learning difficulties. In general learning difficulties really are kind of difficulty learning in most ways, in nearly all ways. And this slide is just outlining the history of this really. You know, when compulsory education first started in Europe in the 19th century and in America, there were some children who really seemed to struggle. First of all, doctors were assigned the task of weeding out those who were incapable of learning, but that wasn't very satisfactory. So we then, psychologists and people like that, started developing tests. The most successful was actually developed in France, the beginning of general intelligence tests. And this helped to clarify what was going wrong, what were the difficulties, were they general or specific? So it turns out really that some children have, not very many, but some children do have severe general learning difficulties, but then a slightly larger group also have moderate learning difficulties, and we tend to call those intellectually disabled nowadays. I'm not really going to talk about that much. I guess you know what I mean. In most mainstream schools, you're not going to see many children with general learning difficulties. Can you go on? Next slide, Tim. Okay, so specific learning disorders or difficulties, really it's that even when the children with intellectual disabilities are selected out and often placed in special schools, there still tend to be some children with unexpected learning difficulties in mainstream schools. And a fairly broad consensus has grown up that we should call these children with specific learning difficulties, and they broadly can learn with some extra help, and the specific means that only some bits of learning are more difficult, not everything. But of course, this can apply right across the board, across all areas, really. So it can apply to language, reading and writing, maths, concentration, socialization and behavior, and motor coordination. And there can be a bunch of quite subtle difficulties, which we're probably not going to talk about today because they're fairly rare. Okay, on we go. Next slide. Okay. When can these things be identified? Well, by and large, the rare disorders, it's very variable. It all depends. So things like central auditory processing difficulty, Turner syndrome, Fragile X, it really depends on the difficulty. And there are loads and loads of them, actually. We certainly don't have time to go into them in any detail. Motor difficulty used to be called dyspraxia, but it's now really called developmental coordination disorder. And usually it's picked up at a preschool level, but not always. Emotional difficulties, well, that can be anxiety or depression, more often at the teenage level, but the transition from kindergarten to primary school can also be a somewhat difficult time. So times of transition, but predominantly at the teenage stage, really. Socialization difficulties, and I mean really autism spectrum disorders, well, from the second year nowadays, although that's a fairly specialized business to do that kind of analysis and diagnosis. I'll come back to that later. Behavior problems, self-control, can occur from around 3 or 4, and as I'm sure you know, can occur right throughout for a whole variety of different reasons, really. Concentration difficulties from about 6, and often varying a bit in terms of the circumstances, the conditions, the learning situation does affect how easy or difficult it is for children to concentrate, and therefore how likely it is for these things to be noticed and picked up and to become a problem. Maths difficulties, well, really only from school entry, because you don't really start learning maths properly until you go into school, but from then on it becomes increasingly important to realize that if a child does have a learning difficulty. In Singapore, I would say year 5, grade 5 is the classic year for picking up maths learning difficulties. For some reason, the Singapore maths curriculum really gets hard at the primary 5 stage. I'm not sure how it is in your curricula. Dyslexia, really from school entry, once you start learning to read and write, it should be possible to identify whether somebody has a genuine difficulty or what at this stage. And dysgraphia writing, well, slightly later than dyslexia, because the main emphasis in literacy is usually on reading at the beginning, writing a bit harder, but from around the same stage, maybe around age 7, I think. So language difficulties, usually this is the province of speech and language therapists, but not necessarily. Speech sound disorders can be picked up around 3 to 4, specific language impairment around 3, but a quite subtle difficulty, which I'm not going to have much time to talk about, reading comprehension impairment, can be as late as 11 before you pick it up. So that's an interesting, important kind of difficulty that people can have with reading, mainly affecting comprehension, and typically as the curriculum becomes more challenging around 10 or 11, it becomes more noticeable. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm really just giving you the kind of all the main names here. This is just a kind of vocabulary list, really. So I've just talked about the different areas. So the syndrome names or the kind of official diagnostic names are here. They can vary a bit, but these are the main ones, really. Okay. Okay, so next time. Okay, so what should you look out for in language? Well, obviously, language is quite a difficult thing to know, to understand. I mean, typically in a primary classroom, a child with a language delay or disorder often kind of sits quietly at the back and doesn't say a lot, and it can be quite difficult to pick it up and to identify it properly. I mean, in a sense, it's easier at the earlier stage, at the kindergarten stage, because it's a bit more obvious, and there's differences between a child with a language difficulty and their peers, but it can be quite persistent, and it can be quite difficult to spot. One of the issues, of course, for most people, or for many families in a Southeast Asian context, is often people are learning more than one language, and they therefore can be bilingual or multilingual, but that comes in all kinds of flavors, really. So I think that I mean, I think there's many advantages to being multilingual, but there can be disadvantages as well, especially for some children. I mean, I heard about a case yesterday, in fact, where a girl had been brought up by an English-speaking father and a Thai origin mother, and she was being brought up in English. And she also had a second language. I think it was Thai. I'm not quite sure. But the mother talked to the girl in English, but unfortunately, the mother's English was not all that great in itself, really. So the child's language, the child's English, lacked depth. There were lots of subtleties and meaning difficulties, meaning issues, and to some extent grammar issues that the child didn't really get. And this was producing considerable signs of frustration and unhappiness in the child in school. So, and obviously that's a tricky one to get a handle on, because it's you know, in a sense it's a home problem, but it's manifesting itself in school. So quite difficult to sort that kind of thing out. As I said, multilingualism can be great. It isn't always a disadvantage. In fact, it can be a real advantage. And particularly, it starts to become a serious advantage if you're satisfactorily multilingual around 15 or 16, because you kind of have two different perspectives or more, two different perspectives on almost anything, and you can bring different kind of cultural ideas to bear from on any issue, really. Bear in mind, in the early years, this problem of glue ear, the proper name is otitis media, can affect reading. You know, that's when children sometimes can't hear properly because there's a kind of build-up of some kind of gunge or whatever it's called in the middle ear, and it needs looking at by doctors and may need treatment, and particularly important because it can impede the development of good phonics just when you need it most. And so again, I have come across a few children who, although they were past that stage now, they still showed signs of having relatively poor phonics because that crucial stage, they weren't able to distinguish sounds very well. So vocabulary, obviously, really, really important. The more words you know, the better. I mean, that's kind of obvious, really. Just to say, phonological difficulties, you'll hear people like me talking about phonological difficulties quite a lot. That's a difficulty with dealing with the sounds that the language is made of. And you can continue to have some phonological difficulties even when your actual oral language is fine. So again, it's a bit subtle and it needs some very careful analysis and testing, generally speaking. And lastly, reading comprehension impairment, as I mentioned, as I said, not usually evident until 9+, and often related to subtle language difficulties. Children have built up a basic sight vocabulary quite well, but then by 9 or 10, you need more subtle, more in-depth comprehension of what you're reading. And if you do have a subtle language difficulty, that can affect your ability to understand what you're reading. And that needs somewhat different approaches to the sort of standard dyslexia problem. Okay, on we go. Okay, vision, generally not much of an issue for most people. In most cases, you know, your standard local optician can deal with it. There is sometimes a bit of a problem with eye strain. Some children do get tired when reading. Usually it's quite difficult to see because you have to keep them reading for quite a while, 20 or 30 minutes, before the problem becomes evident. But if they complain of eye strain, it's not something to dismiss. It's important to try and get to understand what's going on. There can be difficulties related to more general visual spatial reasoning, but that's not to do with visual acuity. It can particularly have a kind of subtle effect on seeing patterns and relationships, and that can be important for maths and science. But on the other hand, if you've got good visual spatial reasoning, you may be very good at art. Okay, so broadly, subtle visual difficulties only affect a small proportion of children with dyslexia. So that's an even smaller proportion of all children. Generally speaking, if there's some reason to worry about that, you need to go and see an optometrist. And that's slightly different to an ophthalmologist or an optician. So you need to find an optometrist. There are certainly plenty of them in Singapore. I'm not sure how many there are in Jakarta. I'm sorry, I don't know. Okay, just to add in, you know, the very common problem of writing letters and numbers backwards, pretty common, not itself really a sign of problems. We now think that you really only need to worry about that if it persists beyond about age 8. However, if a child even below that age of 6 or 7 is having difficulty with reversing letters, then I do think they need to be helped. In other words, draw attention to it, try and find ways to help them remember the difference between B and D, I and J, and so on. So don't ignore it, but it's not necessarily a sign of a deeper, longer lasting problem. It isn't necessarily a sign of dyslexia in particular. Okay, next slide. Okay, memory, really important. Again, a bit like language, quite subtle, not that easy to get, not quite easy, not so easy to identify. And of course, there are many different aspects to memory, and typically we don't have, well, it's difficult to evaluate them all. And actually, typically we don't evaluate them all. We particularly focus on kind of remembering instructions, remembering sequences, and particularly remembering what we call working memory. In other words, the sort of the conscious need to remember information you've just heard and do something with it in your mind before you then give it back. And of course, particularly during reading or listening to a talk, you're using your working memory all the time, because you've got to remember, you know, what was said, the previous phrase, the previous sentence, the previous section, and reintegrate everything new into what you've just heard. So working memory is really important, particularly in comprehension activities, really. But it's important in lots of other ways as well, really. So surprisingly common and surprisingly important. What do you do about it? Well, at a younger age, by and large, there isn't a great deal of direct help you can do. You've really got to structure your presentation, structure the way that children are receiving information so that you're helping them to get it. So you're repeating, you're asking, you're getting them to check, what did I just say? And you're getting them to, you know, to share with a buddy or something, if you can. But then only later, when they get to be perhaps in their teens, there are some programs, usually computer-based, for training working memory. A bit controversial. It's not entirely agreed that they are really good. I mean, as you probably know, the literature on what's called brain gym tends to say if you practice brain gym, you get good at brain gym, but you don't necessarily get better at remembering more general stuff. But there are maybe some exceptions to that. My feeling is that there are some programs where if there's real buy-in, if there's real determination to get better, they can help. But again, as I say, it's really for older students, really. Okay, next slide. Okay, motor stuff, fine motor, posture, and motor planning. As far as school's concerned, this is most likely to affect writing, but there can be also problems with personal organization and also some overlap with social awareness and social skills. There was a theory for quite a long while that if you teach children better motor skills, they will get better at reading. And there were a number of kind of well-advertised programs in England. One of them was called the Doran program, I think. Generally speaking, the evidence wasn't so good for that. Okay, so what must you do? Well, certainly parents and teachers can help children to sit better, to organize themselves, and to improve their writing and drawing skills. However, if you're trying to do that, you're persisting, but it's still a problem, then you might need to see an occupational therapist. They're the key guys to deal with this kind of motor and posture and planning problems, really. And I'll come back to this in a minute, but handwriting, yes, I think handwriting programs can be helpful, little and often, up to about age 10, but then after that, it's really a waste of time. You're not going to get them to change. Better to use keyboarding, really. So worth working on it, as I say, little and often before then, but not after that, really. Okay, Tim, on you go. Okay, so particularly now focusing on dyslexia and dysgraphia. Dysgraphia is just a fancy word for writing difficulty. I mean, the key problem with dyslexia is learning letters and sounds and first words. And some children find making the association between letters and sounds more difficult than others. You know, so what usually occurs is they start to learn words around 5 or 6, and they start to learn letters at the same time. But for some kids, the words seem to be difficult. They can learn some of the letters and the letter sound associations, but the letters don't seem to stick together as they do for most of us. Now, fortunately, Singapore and Indonesia, I think, also don't really expect children to formally perform in school until 7. Of course, unfortunately, Singapore, with its kind of achievement culture, is many parents are pushing their kids to learn to read earlier than that, and that's maybe not such a good idea for some kids, really. So the key problem really in learning to learn in dyslexia is the difficulty learning to read whole words. But there's very, very strong evidence now that using phonics and memory for letter sequences is the key to this, really. So it's really important to develop a well-organized phonics approach to early reading, I think. Usually with dyslexia, spellings also are difficult. And then writing often becomes hard because writing is a very complicated process and there are so many things to remember. So even when the reading becomes easier, there can still be serious problems with writing because it's a multi-layer and quite a difficult process. So the writing difficulty is called dysgraphia. Okay, next slide. Okay. Okay, so fine motor problems, health and social organization. So if you have fine motor problems, in other words, you don't have a general physical posture or coordination difficulty, you can still have some difficulty with fine motor, with handwriting, and you can also have difficulties with personal organization as well. So I've already said, don't worry, don't try to do handwriting training at the secondary stage. I guess I just want to emphasize here that particularly in teenage years, but sometimes in late primary as well, some children need a lot of help to organize themselves. And this can need a lot of adult patience, really. So some children, even though you it's frustrating for the parents, it's frustrating for the teachers too, but you sometimes need to really keep supporting and encouraging them and helping them to organize themselves. So otherwise they'll forget stuff, they'll forget their equipment, and they'll forget what they've got for homework, and they'll get into trouble, and they'll lose ground, and it can be quite disheartening, really. So teaching kids with persistent personal organization problems really needs quite a lot of input, usually particularly from parents, really. So, and just to add, I mean, one of the background things that sometimes can be important is the kind of general health and fitness. And I think, it's as well to keep an eye on the students' diet, their sleep patterns, and their exercising. For some children, they may be affected by not by poor diet. They may not be getting enough sleep, and they may not be taking enough exercise. So, and one of the, particularly in the teenage years, gaming at night, I'm sure you're well aware of this, can be a major source of loss of concentration in school. So again, need to, and often students can be quite good at concealing that from everybody, and so parents tend not to be aware of it sometimes, really. I think it's a good idea, if you're slightly worried about this, even if it's definite knowledge, maybe a good idea to have an informal chat with the parents and say, could he be using his gadgets, his devices at night when you don't know? It can be, it's surprisingly common for that to happen, I think. Okay, next slide. Okay, maths difficulties. Again, loads that we could say, but this is really just an outline, as I've already said. We sometimes use the word dyscalculia. I guess countries differ a bit. So some countries use that word quite a lot, and some countries don't. I think the more general term, maths learning difficulties, are probably easier. Maths is probably more complicated than reading and writing. There can be more things, there are more areas of skill, more areas of knowledge that go into learning maths, probably, than reading and writing. And so some of them that we can sometimes identify as being a problem are what's called number sense. In other words, a kind of really basic underlying sense that 4 is more than 2, and having a kind of a feel for that is what we call number sense. And there are various ways to test that as well. Working memory can certainly affect ability in maths. How quickly you can learn, how well you learn, and how quickly you can recall number facts is really important, because if you can, remember your times tables and even your addition and subtraction bonds quickly and reliably, that makes the whole calculation enterprise significantly easier. If in the middle of doing a multiplication or a division, you have to start sort of checking, okay, what are 5 sevens? That's going to slow you down, and you therefore lose your place. It's easy to make mistakes in that situation. So visual spatial weaknesses, as I've already mentioned, can have subtle difficulties. So particularly, I suppose, in relation to geometry, but other kinds of pattern issues can also be affected by visual spatial difficulties as well. So procedural memory, in other words, doing several things in sequence, logical reasoning, and closely related to that, verbal reasoning and comprehension, all can be weaknesses that can affect maths learning. And of course, last but not least, some children build up a real anxiety about learning maths, and it has a particular name, maths anxiety. They just dread, they know I'm bad at maths, I can't do it. And so they kind of dread the maths lessons, really. And if you're in that state, it's really hard to learn anything new. So it just makes things worse, unfortunately. So fortunately, I don't think any of those things apply to all that many students, but it can be quite a problem. Okay, so yeah, I mean the reason, one of the reasons for why maths and literacy are so different is maths is a very progressive subject. So everything that you do in year 3 is based on what you've done in year 2, and if you haven't got good foundations of year 2 stuff, it makes the year 3 stuff much harder, really. So I quite often find people who are students who are struggling with maths, what they're getting, particularly in tuition, is somebody kind of shadowing their lessons and trying to just give them an extra lesson after the original class lesson. But because the students have poor foundations, that's still not really helping. So often, if it comes to me, in other words, if it's a moderately severe difficulty, I'm nearly always going to say, look, forget about keeping up with what's happening in class. The student needs to get back and rebuild the foundations in tuition. That's what tuition should be for in maths, I think, usually anyway. Okay, on we go. Okay, I'm just going to whiz through this really. So it's hard to sum up attention difficulties. As you know, it's generally speaking called ADHD, and there are 2 main strands to ADHD. One is inattention, difficulty paying attention, and these are the 9 main symptoms of inattention that are picked up in a formal diagnosis of attention difficulties. So any of those, you have to have, I think up to about the age of 17, you have to have 6 of them. After that, you only have to have 5. So 6 of those 9 symptoms fairly commonly seen if you're to have a diagnosable attention difficulty. And next slide. On we go. Yeah, that's right. And then similarly, 6 of 9 symptoms of next slide, Tim, sorry. 6 of 9 of these signs of hyperactivity and impulsivity. Probably in the schools, in international schools that I've seen, less common to see, excuse me, less common to see this kind of problem. More common to see straight inattention without hyperactivity. But of course you can have both, so they can go together. So next slide. Okay, now one of the problems with sort of picking up ADHD is that I've just shown you the symptoms that are formally have to be picked up for a formal diagnosis. However, they picked those 18 different signs because they're relatively reliably identified. Now, there are a whole bunch of other things that might be seen when a student has attention difficulties, and this is just some of them. So, you know, the first one, not uncommon to see students getting easily upset and frustrated, you know, having really quite strong negative feelings, crying or losing their temper in public, being very reactive, particularly, you know, when things are not going their way. That's not in the diagnostic list, but it's obviously quite an important indicator of problems if it's occurring, really. And there are others too. Of course, there are quite a lot of overlaps with other kinds of difficulties. as well. I guess two things to add to this really. One is to say it's probably the most common general advice in dealing with students with ADHD is to avoid confrontations. I don't mean to be that the teacher should be easygoing and say anything goes. No, far from it. I think there do need to be fairly firm and clear guidance in terms of what to do and what not to do. And you need to expect the student to do as they're asked to do. But it's really important to avoid losing, when they lose their temper, it's really important to avoid the teacher losing their temper back, because that's almost certainly going to make it worse. So generally speaking, really important to de-escalate any tensions if there are outbursts, if there are upsets in an ADHD kind of scenario situation. Okay, and the other important thing to say is I don't want to make out that ADHD is, and in fact, in a sense, this applies to pretty well everything I'm saying, but I don't want to, I mean, ADHD is often seen as a kind of big bad problem, but actually nowadays it's not uncommon to find adults who kind of realize when they get to be adults that they probably had ADHD difficulties all along, and quite often they've found ways to adapt and cope with them, and that there can definitely be positives to being a kind of high-speed person who picks up the ball and runs almost immediately. Maybe is a bit impulsive, maybe doesn't think enough about which way they're going, but has a lot of energy and can be quite creative and positive, as well as being a bit impulsive, really. So many good things about being ADHD. And as I say, certainly if you meet adults who have realized that they have had this problem, they often tell quite a positive story about this. And perhaps they also say, okay, when I was diagnosed, when I realized it seemed like a terrible problem, but with help, I learned to adapt. And now I'm pretty glad that I'm ADHD, because that means I've got a lot more energy than some people. So it can be a very positive thing, I think. Okay, next slide. Okay, just a very quickie on autism. Probably, autism probably the most difficult one of all of these things, really, from my point of view, to identify. Nowadays, we see autism as a spectrum with all degrees of intellectual functioning, right from very bright to very severe difficulties, but also with social communication difficulties and some other things as well. So how early can you pick up autism? Well, nowadays, probably some people anyway believe you can identify it from 2. And certainly the evidence from retrospective history seems to be that there are 2 main pathways. So gradually at 2, the signs of autism emerged, or suddenly there was a regression around that age, and previously good skills, particularly in language, seem to get lost, and from then on it's a struggle. So usually around 2 seems to be the critical age, but in some cases that's not picked up, and sometimes people don't get diagnosed until all the way through, until quite late, or even until adults, really. Okay. In my opinion, well, it's not just my opinion, generally, if you read stuff from official autism bodies, they say really autism should be assessed multidisciplinarily. In other words, it shouldn't just be the psychologist or the doctor or the speech therapist or the occupational therapist. it should be a combination of folk, because it's actually really quite difficult to be sure that what you're seeing is autism. There's overlaps with other things. And of course, it can be in all degrees as well. There are some special tests, such as the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, ADOS, which I personally am not trained to use, so I don't use it. But that in itself isn't enough. Just because you've done an ADOS doesn't necessarily mean that you can do a diagnosis. It's really best done on a multidisciplinary basis. So quickly, the main signs and symptoms are rigidity of thought and habits, you know, the famous thing of lining things up, making sure that the toys are all in order, always wanting things to be exactly the same, the physical things always wanting to be the same way, and then lack of awareness of others' feelings, lack of, it's sometimes called theory of mind, sometimes not necessarily, but often high sensory sensitivity. In other words, what seem to be not particularly high and terrible noise or sounds can be really upsetting to some particularly young autistic people. And sometimes, again, not always, signs of really high anxiety, especially when routines change. And the latter is particularly associated with what's often called meltdown. So if you've got if you've worked with an autistic child, a well-diagnosed and very clear autistic child, the chances are they may sometimes have kind of suddenly lost their temper and had screaming, crying, banging, shouting, running out episodes, generally called meltdowns. And so that's probably, we now think, a lot to do with high anxiety. And so, of course, what you have to do is to manage the situation, make sure that the child understands what's going to happen next, and help them to predict any changes that are about to occur. It is actually becoming slightly more common, I understand, and there's a higher proportion of autistic diagnoses now where language is fine. So in other words, and that's maybe as much as 50% of all autistic diagnoses, language is fine. So poor language is no longer felt to be a good indicator of autism. Sadly, it is still fairly consistently very much a boy's problem. But there are some autistic girls, unfortunately also, they're quite hard to spot because they tend to be quieter, they tend to not to bring their difficulties to the notice of adults, and so it can be harder to identify autistic girls. Okay, can you cure it? No, it's a lifelong condition, but very much a lot can be done to help the students themselves adapt more positively. And of course, if the people working with the child or with the student know what to expect and have some background knowledge, again, it's possible to learn ways to manage them and help them to develop much more effectively. And of course, nowadays, it's not uncommon for some employers to actually look for autistic people. So it's, again, by no means a totally bad thing. It can actually be quite valuable and helpful for, in some circumstances, for some kinds of jobs to have some autistic qualities, I think. Okay, next slide. Okay, all degrees of severity, yes, pretty well, except in a few kind of very specific syndrome cases where there's probably a single genetic cause. In most areas, there can be all degrees, so students can vary quite widely in their competence. Unfortunately, for some purposes, we're forced to say yes or no. Is there a problem, or is there a diagnosis, or isn't there? And that can occur um, when you need exam accommodations. So you've got to decide whether it's helpful to give a diagnosis, because if you don't give a diagnosis, you may not get the exam accommodations that you think are needed, which is a pity in some ways, but that's how it is, unfortunately. Um, in my opinion, I always feel this is something that it's not my decision. Ultimately, I want to discuss that with parents. And if parents want me not to say the child is dyslexic, then I'm more than happy to say the child has a reading difficulty which needs X, Y, and Z help. So I don't have to say I don't have to give a diagnosis, but sometimes it's helpful. In some exam situations, particularly the UK, particular test scores come in. I think in Singapore we don't have this. I'm glad to say the Singapore exam boards are pretty okay with just a professional opinion, but in some, particularly in the UK, you've got to have some scores at 85 or below, which is sometimes quite a pain, really. Okay, next slide. Okay, and can you have more than one specific learning difficulty? Yeah, I'm afraid you can. So a good example is specific language impairment. There's if you have an early speech and language difficulty, specific language impairment, that there's good evidence that gives you a 50% chance of later being dyslexic, because of course reading dyslexia is a predominantly language based learning. Okay, in general, the medical word is comorbidities. It's a horrible word that I dislike, but it's just a way of describing that. It seems surprising that if you have, if there were no links between these difficulties, if the percentage, if 7% of people are dyslexic and 5% are dyscalculic, then the chance of having both should be 0.35%, but it's not. It's actually more like 3%. In other words, it's having one disability or one disorder difficulty makes you more likely to have another, unfortunately. We're not quite sure why, probably to do with the very complicated business of how our genes get expressed, which in the last 20 years we've been learning more and more about, but we still haven't really got it all sussed. Okay, however, the good news really is that nowadays most children with specific learning difficulties can be taught positively, taught ways to overcome their difficulties. Nearly always this involves more effort on their part and some additional help in some way or another. And at the end of the day, people who've experienced specific learning difficulties can come out stronger. So, I mean, I was recently reading a book which suggested that if you have a moderately severe difficulty, not too severe, but moderate difficulty across a whole range of difficulties, then you may be more creative than usual. Now, so, I mean, I think there is quite good evidence that Albert Einstein was somewhat ADHD. There's certainly very clear evidence from his book that Richard Branson was dyslexic, and that seemed to help him become a kind of a big picture guy who could see what other people couldn't see when he was developing his companies. And I only recently heard or discovered that Charles Darwin, the superhero scientist who discovered the theory of evolution, had probably had pretty severe anxiety problems. So good evidence that there are some positive compensations to having specific learning difficulties of a moderate degree. Okay, on we go. Okay, just very, very quickly on behavior issues. Okay, I'd just like to mention that if you're seeing children with a behavior problem in school, I think I would advise you to look to see if there might be some learning issues as well. In my experience, behavior problems in school usually go with some learning difficulties. And sometimes if you can work on the learning difficulties, that can ease the behavior substantially. Not always, but often. Okay, if you're sure it's just behavior, then there's a huge amount we could say. I just want to give a quick plug to something I've come across fairly recently, and that's Ross Green's collaborative and proactive solutions approach, which basically is the main point really is listening to, believing what the child, him or herself, says about their difficulties, why they're struggling with some problem. And I mean, his slogan really, and it's more than a slogan, is that children don't want to have problems. If they have problems, it's because they're struggling to solve some problem. They can't solve the problem unaided. It's not that they don't want to solve the problem, they do, but they can't, and they need help to solve the problem. So just very broadly, I think it's probably just worth mentioning, as far as teachers are concerned, it's not that difficult to miss signs that a child is struggling. I know this from my own experience. I remember in one of my classes really only discovering at the end of the year that a particular girl was really not reading, and how I had managed to miss that for a whole year, I still don't know, and it still hurts to think about that. But it's not that difficult to do. Be careful not to give false hope when you're talking to the child or the parent that they'll get over it. Of course, sometimes they will, but it can be unhelpful, and it can make the problem worse. You don't have to be a super expert on all aspects of learning and all learning difficulties, but it's useful to have a bit of background knowledge so that you can have a reasonably balanced discussion with parents about this. And conversely, I feel that for parents, some parents can be quite critical of school and teachers, and can be wanting to kind of take over, really. My general advice to most parents, if their child has a behavior problem in school, is that you can't possibly see what's happening in the class, and you really can't be sure of what's going on and whether or not the teachers really understand your child or not. So the important thing for you as a parent is to try and make good relationships with the key teachers and to work positively with the school. If you try and fight the school, it's almost certainly going to end in tears. Okay, and just as a general rule, okay, most learning is a bit bumpy, I think. So you don't expect children to learn everything every day. They can go up and down. Okay, so I'm just trying to summarize kind of the feelings about this. So, okay, there are lots of the specific learning difficulties that I've run through. There's a lot, and a lot of things can be difficult for children. So that's worrying. But I mean, the good news is that mostly nowadays quite a lot can be done to help. Of course, I think it's important to say we're only beginning to understand the causes and consequences of specific learning difficulties. The advent of neuroscience is already beginning to help and make a difference, but there's a long way to go before that really starts to impact how we understand learning in any very detailed way, I think, at the moment. So, but the good news is that schools and society as a whole are becoming more positive and sympathetic to children with learning difficulties. So even with autism, which can be pretty challenging, there's a growing realization that autistic people have some really important strengths, and if you can support them and bring those strengths out, then it can be pretty good. Okay, next slide, Tim. Okay, I mean, I'm trying to summarize what educational psychologists can do, and the focus has mainly been on learning. Just very quickly then on emotional and behavioral difficulties, how we would go about looking is kind of all those things really. So a kind of fairly structured process of gathering information in different ways, listening to key people, and then trying something out and see what happens. Possibly arranging extra help outside or within the school as well. Need to bear in mind that the circumstances and conditions affecting learning can vary in subtle ways. And for example, early or trauma that children have had at some stage in life can actually linger in subtle ways, longer perhaps than some parents might expect, and children might need to return to therapy. It isn't necessarily going to be sorted out within the first 6 months. It might take quite a lot longer. And of course, some of the circumstances that children have to face are unfortunately, family breakup, divorce, or even illness, parents becoming parents becoming ill. So there are lots of things that can create special difficulties for children, really. And some problems then might need very specialized people much more specialized than me, like neurologists or neurochemists, and of course speech and language therapists and specialist counselors. Some of the issues and problems might need more highly specialized help than I can possibly offer. Okay, and finally, just to say, schools are not all the same. So sometimes, without wanting to fault any particular school, each school has some things to offer, but not every school offers the same things. So sometimes it is helpful to consider a change of school. Not very often, I think, but sometimes it is. Okay, on we go. Next slide. Okay, just a very quick kind of, I think I'm talking mainly to teachers. Is that right, Tim? Yep, good. This is my kind of quick summary of how parents can help. I think there are lots of ways that they can help. And so attitudes is the first one, really. I mean, in Singapore, as I'm sure you, and I don't know, I imagine it's probably not so different in Jakarta. Many parents are actively helping their children with homework, are actively kind of tutoring their children, probably during COVID, even more so, if they can, if they've got time. And okay, that's fine. I mean, I feel, in my opinion, if there is a moderately serious specific learning difficulty, it may not always be satisfactory for the parent to be the main helper. They can often support, but sometimes it is better to bring in a specialist, experienced tutor as well. So I don't think parents should be expected to do everything for all kids. I think it varies quite a lot, really. Okay, language, of course, there's lots that can be done. We all know that it gets harder, and even at the best dining tables, adults these days quite often pick up their phone and are busy more interacting with their phone than they're interacting with the other people at the table. So it is important perhaps to emphasize that actual real live language is great, and talking about stuff together, having good conversations is one of the most important things about helping your kids to learn, really. I don't think there's anything wrong with watching TV or watching downloads or DVDs, but it's actually better to do it with the child than to let them play with the device or do it on their own. It is better to share, because that means you can have some interaction and you can check out any kind of subtleties or language difficulties that the child may not have picked up really. Again, nothing wrong with playing online games, but be careful to ration it. Don't let it happen too much. And I know many people say, kind of something like maximum an hour during the week and maximum 2.5 hours at the weekend, that kind of thing really. Maybe some people say none at all during the week, only at the weekend really. So it's important not to allow that to happen too much really, I think. So a harder one is understanding social skills, it's not explaining to kids how and why we should and shouldn't do this or say that. It's quite difficult sometimes to explain, but the more that parents can kind of informally bring up that kind of thing, if a child does have some difficulty with social skills, the better it is really. And generally speaking, we all need to develop our emotional literacy, so we can all benefit from having conversations about how we feel, and parents are the best people to encourage that to get going really. So I'm afraid I'm a bit over time, but let's just try and whiz through to the end. Tim, next slide. Okay. So I mean, this is just a quick kind of, as it were, schematic outline of how an educational psychologist goes about an investigation. Step number one, make it as clear as possible what the problem is. And that doesn't necessarily mean pinning it down to very specific things, but it's really important to know whether you're getting somewhere, to know what kind of problem the parents are asking. So it might be a general kind of, is he achieving well enough? Or it might be, does he have dyslexia? Does he have a specific learning difficulty? So it's really helpful to clarify what the point of the whole thing is, really. And then there's a whole bunch of different ways of getting information. That would obviously particularly include getting all kinds of records and history, different people's views, and especially, in my opinion anyway, getting hold of previous assessments. I think there are some psychologists who kind of don't want to see what's been said, what previous assessments are or were. I'm not that kind. I think it's really important to build on what's been said and done before. Usually I find some differences, but those differences are often helpful and meaningful. And so I do think it's helpful to build on any previous assessments, really. Then we try and sort of come up with some ideas as to what's going on, why might there be a problem, and so some of the activities we do will be trying to test out this explanation. Does it make sense? Lots of discussion, helpful. At the end of the day, a report is written, and the report then goes to the parents. It's their property, and it's up to them to decide whether they want to share it with anybody else in particular, whether they want to share it with the school. I nearly always recommend to parents that they do share it with the school, but there may be some issues in terms of language. They don't want me to say it in this way or in that way, so we have to decide what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So sometimes from a school's point of view, you may need to be aware that sometimes the language has been softened a bit, perhaps, in order to make sure that it's reasonably acceptable from the parent's point of view. Okay, so then ideally there might be follow-up. So, I mean, broadly speaking, trying to answer the question, so what do educational psychologists do? Well, as you know, modern schooling is kind of focuses on both general high achievement, trying to get the students to do as well as they possibly can and pass all those exams, and also on inclusion, on helping them to be a good member of the community, to enjoy their experiences at school, to have fun as they learn. Unfortunately, sometimes there's a trade-off, and maybe it's not always possible to have perfectly well included and perfectly high achieving students at once. And what the educational psychologist is trying to do, among other things, is to identifying the best balance between the different strands of this, really trying to well, with the parents, come to the best decision. So I mean, you know, very, very broadly, the finding from the UK is that mainstream education enables students with special needs to achieve more highly, but they're not so happy. They have a harder time. Whereas special schools, they don't achieve quite so well, but they're happier. And of course, you know, there's all degrees, there's all variations in between, really. Okay, so on we go. I'm looking at the kind of a summary of the report that you read. There's actually a summary at the very beginning of the report. I don't know. I mean, I think, Tim, maybe now is a good time to take questions, really.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. That was really, really insightful. So thank you so much for sharing those insights. We do have some questions that have come through, so I would like to start. Yeah. The first question is from Marina Sismadan, and she said she doesn't have a psychology background, but there is a need to have some sort of early identification, especially for new students or during admission. Is there any type of checklist that could help teachers or principals to detect signs of any specific learning disorders that need to be supported? And she just says that they're not an inclusive school, but they really do want to cater and to support students with different abilities and intelligences as much as possible.
Sure, there are, but I'm sorry, I can't recall exactly what they're called right now. Maybe if I do a bit of research and send you some references on that, really. But yes, you're right, and that's a good idea. I agree to do some kind of checklisting. Do you mean something that the parents would complete, or what, or that the previous school would complete? What are we talking about here?
Possibly something during the enrollment process. What could be things to look for when they initially start school,
okay,
to help with early identification, whether that involves parents or previous background that could be involved in.
Okay, I mean, I think obviously, again, there's a balance to be struck here, isn't there? Because I mean, I know some parents have told me that they've been slightly scared by some such checklists, and they've been worried that if they tick too many boxes, they won't be allowed in. So I don't know. I guess there's a bit of a dilemma, really. Is it better to do that through a checklist, which can be a little bit off-putting, a little bit formal, or is it better to do it through interview and discussion? And you know, I think. I generally speaking, if I'm suggesting to parents that they go and visit school X, I ask them to, be as forthcoming as they feel they can be, but also to kind of try and kind of sense the mood, get a sense of how inclusive the school is likely to be, and so I think it's a bit two-way, really. A school that wants to be inclusive needs to make sure that it can convince new parents and of course existing parents, convince parents that you're pretty positive about students I mean, realistically, you probably can't take all students with any kind of difficulty. That's just not realistic. But you need to find ways to reassure parents that most kids can be supported and helped, and it'll only be the maybe extreme difficulties that you'll have difficulty with. But finding the right way to do that, I don't know. My feeling is it might be better to do it in a conversation rather than to do it through checklists, really.
She did add to that, just saying what she meant was really more of an internal document for teachers or principals to use during any observations that they're making.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay. So fine. I'll see if I can find one or two examples of that. Yeah, sure, can.
All right, we have another question. This one's from Doremi Excellent School, and it says, how do we refer students with special needs to the right school? Because sometimes parents expect the school to accept them even if they can't really support the special needs they have.
Yeah, okay, that's a pretty broad and difficult question, I'm afraid. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to, to be honest, I don't really know the Jakarta context very well. I mean, my understanding is that as far as international schools, the expatriate community, there aren't many schools that are taking a broad range of, that are taking many students with well identified or significant special educational needs. I think I'm right, Tim. You're nodding. There aren't many such schools. Is that right? Yeah.
Not many. No.
No. Okay.
There are some, but not too many.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah. As far as Jakarta is concerned, then I'm sorry. I think I'm probably not the best person to ask. I mean, as far as Singapore is concerned, we're improving all the time, and of course, within the government sector, I mean, Singapore has quite a strong and well set up and I think well organized and generally speaking well run bunch of special schools, but they only cater for fairly severe difficulties. The mainstream schools then look after the great majority of students. In other words, nearly all dyslexics, in fact, all dyslexics, all children with maths difficulties, not all autistic, but most autistic students with high functioning autistic students, and many students with ADHD and language difficulties and so on. And there, the kind of the amount of support varies quite well, isn't all that great, to be honest. But nevertheless, by and large, teachers' attitudes are reasonably positive, and people bend over backwards to try and help the students and keep them going and stuff. So I feel in Singapore, the government schools are, okay, there's more that can be done, and actually the government is trying to increase the amount of support. And they've just announced a new program of training more people to support kids in mainstream schools. In the international sector, again, it used to be quite a, as it were, a seller's market. In other words, when I first came to Singapore, it was very common for parents to be really quite wary of telling schools about specific learning difficulties. So even sort of fairly ordinary dyslexia, what are we going to say to the school? Oh, I'd rather you didn't say this or that. That was pretty common. It's now not so bad, and of course COVID has changed the numbers enormously. So now most of these schools are a bit worried about shrinking roles because of people going back to their country of origin. So, but in any case, they've become more inclusive. They have, by and large, got many schools have got quite decent support services, at least many of the bigger schools anyway, the medium band schools perhaps a bit less. And there are a range of more specialist schools for students with mild to moderate difficulties as well. So, I mean, I guess, sorry, coming back to the Jakarta situation, I mean, the short answer is I don't know enough about the situation at the moment, and I don't know how you would find out. There must be people with a fairly good general knowledge. Once the hopefully once the virus is over and we all go back to attending schools most of the time, that certainly it would be nice to try and find out a bit more about that, really.
I have another question from Gareth Steed. As the head of counseling at an international school, as well as running his own learning and behavior counseling clinic, one of the biggest issues he's faced in Indonesia is the acceptance from parents that their child may have a learning or behavioral or emotional issue or disorder. So from your perspective, how can we bring parents on board so that we can all collaboratively help the children?
I'm not sure I quite understood the question, Tim. Are you saying the guy, the head of counseling, finds that parents are over expecting their children will have difficulties, or under expecting?
Basically, not accepting that they actually do have an issue.
Oh, not accepting, right. In other words, difficulty, coming to terms with the idea that there might be a specific learning difficulty. Right, yes, yeah, of course, I've heard that quite a few times, particularly in an Indonesian context, so I'm not surprised to hear that. Yeah, I'm sure you're right. Acceptance is a problem. You know, how does general acceptance of specific learning difficulties get spread? I don't know, through many different ways, I guess, really. I mean, as you probably know, I mean, in Singapore, it's been a long, slow process, but there was a huge step change when Lee Kuan Yew let it be known that he was dyslexic. And as a result of that, the Singapore Dyslexia Association, which was already developing very well, you know, received a huge boost, a huge fillip. And now, as far as dyslexia is concerned, it's rarely a serious stigma. Indeed, it might even be the other way, that people actually kind of want to get diagnosed when maybe it's not so appropriate, really. So, you know, it varies quite a lot in terms of, it matters quite a lot what's happening in the context more generally. I mean, similarly with autism, ADHD too, you know, there's a much better general acceptance of these things. But I mean, how do you bring this kind of thing about? Well, I'm not sure. I think you know, well-known celebrities being able to talk about this openly is certainly a big important thing, really. So I'm not sure if there are any sort of Indonesian celebrities who have been able to tell the world about their reading difficulties or their ADHD or whatever difficulties they might have. That's enormously helpful, really. Is there other kind of professional support groups, professional associations, parent support groups for different conditions? Again, all of those things can be really helpful in, as it were, helping to generate a culture in which acceptance is more common, if you know, than elsewhere. I mean, I know there is an Indonesian Dyslexia Association. My understanding is it's not all that large, but that it's quite active. Similarly for other groups as well, I think.
Just to follow up on that, is there anything on a personal level that, you know, not necessarily, you know, culturally or in society, but just the approach that we could take when communicating with families, that we might suspect something, or should we, you know, bring in some help for specialists from outside? Do you have any suggestions on how we would approach that on a very personal level?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I agree. That's a good idea. I mean, I guess if you could perhaps have one or two, as it were, histories, case studies, anonymized, obviously, that helps. In other words, being able to tell a story to the parents. Look, the parents of Aisha had the same worries as you have. That they didn't want, and they felt very worried that she might have some difficulty. But actually, when X, Y, and Z was done and said, there were noticeable improvements, and everybody was happier as a result. I think two or three case studies around, people, students who've had similar difficulties can be really helpful. I mean, obviously, case studies of famous adults internationally can also be helpful. I mean, so it is helpful to be able to name a few very prominent people who had difficulties but who've come through well. I mean, I only discovered myself only a few days ago that Lewis Hamilton, I believe, the motor racing driver, is dyslexic, and in spite of that, he's become an amazing motor racing driver. So I think case studies is probably the best, Tim, really.
All right, we have another question here from Rafika, and she says she has a student who was diagnosed with dyslexia when he was in first grade. He had done some therapies, speech therapy, sensory integration therapy, but they stopped during the pandemic. He's in fourth grade now, and he's producing sentences and paragraphs, and he's struggling a lot, producing sentences and paragraphs. And instruction has to be simplified. He tends to forget easily. And she's asking, is there any effect that dyslexia has with memory for a child? Because she's worried that there might be other diagnoses other than dyslexia.
Right. So was the main concern memory difficulties? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. I mean, yes, the answer is yes. It almost certainly there can be. That would be fairly common. I would say that students with dyslexia do often have working memory difficulties. That they do tend to go together, really. I'm sorry to hear about the effect of the pandemic on this, and I'm sure other students as well. We're expecting, generally speaking, that of course, there's been a general effect on most students. I think certainly we just did a survey among our counselling colleagues in Singapore last week, actually, and most school counsellors are seeing kind of a mix, mostly kind of an increase in low-level concerns, kind of difficulty, slightly more difficulty concentrating, more anxiety. Some kind of struggles in terms of getting on with your peers, all of these things not quite as good as they were last year, probably because of the pandemic, really. And also considerable signs of teacher stress, perhaps more than in previous years, really. So a lot of background effects to the pandemic. We didn't ask specifically about the effect on students with difficulties, but I think you'd expect that there would be more effect on them than on other students as well, and especially if therapy that's been ongoing had to be stopped. So if it's at all possible to get the therapy back up and running in one way or another, I mean, if all else fails, can it be done online? Certainly, there's a lot of therapy being done online in Singapore right now. Could it be done online, or even could it be done, one-to-one with social distancing in a tuition center? I do think there will be a lot to be said for trying to get it back up and running, really, in this student's case, really. So, maybe try and persuade the parent to, or maybe help the parent to try and make connections and find ways to get the student back into the therapy that they were having, really.
One more. This is from Aditya, and she says that some students in maybe high school level will be afraid to reveal their learning disabilities due to the fear of being ostracized by their peers.
Yeah.
And is there a way to involve students in helping their friends who have learning difficulties so that it can build their confidence?
Sure. Okay. Again, a not unfamiliar problem, I know. And I'm sorry, I can't. My first response is, I know, is just to talk in sort of very broad generalities, really. I heard a story only a couple of days ago about a class teacher who went out of their way to not only to have more students with learning difficulties in their class, but also went out of their way to encourage them to talk to each other, to tell each other about their learning difficulties and what their strengths and weaknesses were, and obviously with a considerable emphasis on the strengths, but being honest about it as well, not trying to sweep things under the carpet. I think there are, it takes some courage, it takes some confidence to be able to do that, but the scenario that transpired was a very positive one, and the particular child that was the focus of concern in this kind of example did really well. I mean, he was an autistic student, quite a bright autistic student, but he was in a class with other students with a whole bunch of different learning differences and difficulties, and the whole, the class developed a very positive, caring culture, and it was okay. It was perfectly okay to have some difficulties, some differences, but at the same time because nearly everybody who has difficulties also has strengths. So I agree that that's not necessarily a common scenario. I think it depends on the school, and I think the key people to talk to are, if it's an international school, is the school counselling people, they may well be able to help with a particular class or even with the school as a whole in terms of trying to help the class or the school to develop a more inclusive, a more accepting, a more positive approach to understanding and sharing learning differences. Really, it's not easy, and I agree. In some ways, it gets harder at the the secondary level, because kind of all the identity stuff is really going crazy at that time, and people are working. All the students are working so hard to define themselves, and some of them do it in very strange and weird ways. So it's hard to develop a kind of common culture of acceptance in that situation, but it shouldn't be impossible. So as I say, I feel that the school counselling department are the key people to try and help in that sort of situation, really.
All right, thank you, Tim. That's yeah, that was the questions we had. So really appreciate you taking the time to answer those.
Okay.
Is there anything else you'd like to say, Dr. Tim, just to finish off the webinar?
Are you asking me or asking other people, Tim?
No, you, Dr. Tim. Anything you'd like to summarize or just finish off the webinar with?
Okay. I think I probably talked too much, really. But no, it's been fun, and I'm really grateful to you all for listening so patiently. Obviously, it's slightly weird doing it online because I can only see a handful of faces, and some of them are just photographs, and some of them are not live. So I just normally when you're talking to a large group of people, you can pick up all kinds of cues in terms of how whether they're interested, and whether whether they're agreeing with you or not, really. So frankly, I haven't a clue how you feel about all the stuff that you've just heard from me. But so, can I invite you to give me some feedback? I'd really like you, through Tim, to tell me what was helpful and what wasn't, what was new and what you'd heard before, and what, if anything, you'd like to hear more about, because there's obviously a lot more to be said, really.
Thank you, Dr. Tim. Just the last few minutes, is there anyone else that would like to make a comment or give some live feedback right now? Anyone like to say anything? Just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. Is that a thumbs up, Miss Murray? You wanted to, oh, here we go. Gareth.
There we go. Just wanted to say thank you very much. It's been very, very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I agree pretty much with everything you said, that it is, especially at the moment, a very, very difficult time for us as counselors and psychologists to deal with children. Just one thing I would like to say to everybody is that it's not going to go away once school reopens. The problems that the children are currently facing, especially those who have special needs issues, emotional problems, behavioral problems, they're going to get worse before they get better. So you're going to have to really keep an eye on your children when they come back, they start to come back to school, and work with your counseling departments, work with clinicians, work with counselors and with psychologists to really get the best for the children, because it's going to get really tough.
Agree. And Gareth, just saying it back to you, and I appreciate that it's also tough for the teachers, and it's also tough for the counselors as well. I think we're all struggling in the present situation, really, and it's hard for everybody, I think. And you're absolutely right. It's not going to get better anytime soon. It could well be just as bad, if not worse, even when we've all been vaccinated. So anyway, but let's hope it doesn't go on forever anyway.
Yeah. Thanks, Gareth. Anyone else like to make any comment or question before we finish? All right, we've had some messages coming in. Tim just saying thank you. They've learned a lot from the webinar. We agree. It's been very interesting. Learned a lot about specific learning disorders and what to pay attention to. A lot of other messages saying thank you. It was very useful. So thanks, Tim. Thank you, Dr. Tim, and really appreciate you taking the time to do this for us.
Okay, thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much indeed.
All right, everyone, on behalf of New Zealand School Jakarta, thank you for attending this webinar. Really do appreciate it. It was great to have you join us for this. See you guys. Bye-bye.